Step into the abyss and welcome to Weird Encounters, a place where the ordinary fades into shadow and the unexplainable comes alive. Make sure you hit the like button, subscribe, and join our ever-growing community of the curious. Your support is the lifeblood that keeps this channel alive. Now, prepare yourself, for what you're about to witness is not for the faint of heart. 5 years of trail work had made Carter's life a little more than an adventure. As a park ranger deep in Colorado's Elk Ridge Reserve, he felt like he knew every leaf, tree, and trail like the back of his hand. These forested mountains were home, a place where he maintained trails for hikers and ensured they were safe and clear. Each day, he walked beneath towering pines and jagged cliffs, keeping pathways open and tending to the wilderness with the quiet appreciation of someone who loved the land. He didn't just see it as work. It was his way of connecting to the wild, finding peace in the solitude of nature's steady rhythm. Red and gold leaves carpeted the ground, and Carter was out alone, far from any sign of civilization, clearing a narrow path that twisted through a dense part of the forest. The season had been especially windy, so he was focused on hauling off broken branches and clearing fallen logs. It was exhausting work, but something about the quiet satisfaction of keeping the trails clear for others gave him a sense of purpose. Then, a strange smell hit him. It was sharp, sour, and foul, something unfamiliar, yet unmistakably rotten. Carter had been around plenty of decaying logs and animals in his time, but this smell was different, both pungent and overpowering. His senses pricked up. As he paused, trying to locate the source, he noticed the woods around him had gone eerily silent. No birds, no scurrying critters, only the whisper of the wind brushing through the leaves. He felt an odd prickle of unease, something that rarely happened to him out here. Pushing forward, Carter scanned the shadows, listening closely. Then, faint and muffled, he heard it, a deep groan mixed with a bark. It sounded nearby, yet somehow felt distant, muffled in a way that didn't fit with the open air of the forest. His pulse quickened, and he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Carter was used to hearing all sorts of wildlife noises, but this was different, both strange and unnervingly close. It wasn't a sound he recognized from any animal he knew. Curiosity drew him forward, though every instinct told him to keep his distance. Carter marked his path as he advanced, brushing branches aside as he moved toward the sound. The smell grew stronger, and the noise intensified, like something was moving just beyond the trees. He pushed past a large, low-hanging branch, and then he saw it, a figure, looming in the twilight, partially obscured by shadows but unmistakably massive, with a thick coat of fur that was mottled in patches of brown, dark gray, and streaks of rusty red. He could make out a heavy brow and a powerful build that was more human. Frozen in place, Carter felt a strange mixture of fear and wonder. He watched as the creature stood there, seemingly unaware of him, its deep-set eyes reflecting the last rays of sunlight in a strange, almost glowing way. He's afraid that the slightest movement would draw its attention. Was this some rare animal? Could it be a bear, distorted by the dusk light? But the size, the shape, even the way it moved felt wrong for any animal he knew. And just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature turned and vanished into the thick undergrowth, its powerful limbs carrying it away with an ease and grace that seemed impossible for something of its size. Carter blinked, unsure if he'd truly seen what he thought he'd seen. It left no sound, no movement in its wake. For a long moment, he just stood there, staring at the empty space where the creature had been. He felt the world around him slowly come back into focus. Back at the ranger station that evening, Carter couldn't shake the encounter from his mind. He replayed it again and again, trying to explain it to himself. but each time it became harder to dismiss what he'd seen. He considered all possibilities, even exhaustion, but none of them truly fit. It lingered in his thoughts, an unspoken mystery that clung to him, resurfacing each time he ventured back to that trail. Every snap of a twig in his nightly rounds brought the memory rushing back, filling him with both a thrill of wonder and a shiver of unease. My dear watchers, your presence is a gift. Thank you for your time, your curiosity, your courage. But remember, there are others who wander, unaware of the dangers that await. By liking this video and subscribing, you offer them a light in the darkness. Support our channel and keep the stories coming, simply by giving a thumbs up and subscribing and sharing. I'm no stranger to fishing at night. There's something special about the peace under the stars, where it's just you, the water, and a quiet world. One particular night, I found myself on Stony Creek Lake, where I'd fished for years. It was my favorite spot. It's usually so quiet there, and I was hoping to reel in a big catfish or maybe even a bass. But I wasn't just there for the fish. It was the stillness, the sky, and the gentle transition from day to night that made me love it. I got ready, setting up my old fishing rod and preparing my bait. When everything was ready, I cast the line into the calm water. There's a satisfying sound when the bait hits the lake, a gentle plop that ripples out into the quiet night. Then, it was just me and the stars, with nothing but the soft sounds of water lapping against the boat. But that night felt strange. There was an odd charge in the air, like a hidden tension building up. Even the bugs that usually buzzed around were silent. It made the place feel too quiet, and it put me on edge. But I shrugged it off and cast my line, telling myself that it was just another quiet night at the lake. A little while later, a heavy splash came from across the water. This wasn't a little fish leaping or some random animal dipping in. It sounded big, like something had crashed into the water. I squinted, trying to see what caused it, but the dark made it hard to spot anything. All I saw was the water's surface rippling out, as if disturbed by something strong. Then came a strange sound that carried across the lake. It wasn't a noise I'd ever heard before. I've heard coyotes, owls, and all sorts of wildlife on my nights here. But this was different. This was unnerving. A sound that felt out of place and made me feel, for the first time, that maybe I wasn't alone. After a few long moments, I heard something from the reeds along the shoreline. My eyes followed the sound, and that's when I saw it, a pair of eyes glinting in the moonlight. They were bright yellow, like nothing I'd ever seen in an animal before. I tried to convince myself it was just my playful imagination, but those eyes were too high up, and there was something almost aware in the way they watched me. I stayed very still, my heart pounding. I couldn't tell if I was more scared or curious. The eyes didn't move, just stared at me, as if observing. Then, to my horror, a dark shape began to rise out of the water. I was startled, gripping my fishing rod tightly as I watched this towering figure emerge. It had a strange, scaled body that gleamed in the moonlight, and a head with long, sharp teeth. The sight of it made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the shape of the creature, but the sense of wrongness it carried with it. I could barely believe what I was seeing. The creature let out another low growl, sending waves of fear through me. My body wanted to move, to flee, but I felt rooted in place, unable to look away from this strange, monstrous figure that seemed like something out of a nightmare. Then, just like that, it sank back into the lake, leaving only ripples behind. The silence that followed was heavy, but I knew I had to get out of there. My peaceful fishing spot had turned into something strange and terrifying. I scrambled to pack up my gear, my hands shaking. As quickly and quietly as I could, I rowed back to shore, my eyes darting around, half expecting to see those glowing eyes watching me from the water. When I got back home, the image of the creature lingered in my mind. I kept seeing those yellow eyes in the shadows and hearing that low growl in the silence. Stony Creek Lake, my favorite spot, no longer felt like the calm, peaceful place I had known. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature again, rising from the water. Since that night, I've returned to the lake only a few times, but it's never felt the same. I can't shake the feeling that something is out there, waiting. The sounds of the night that once comforted me now only make me uneasy. And sometimes, when the moon is bright and the air feels still, I catch myself glancing over the water, wondering if I'll see those eyes again. Stony Creek Lake calls to me even now as if daring me to return, but I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to fish alone there again. One rainy summer afternoon, a young girl named Laura discovered a video channel about mysterious stories. She only found the channel a few weeks before but was already hooked. Every story shared felt so personal, and they often reminded her of her own strange memory, a memory she hadn't told many people about. Laura grew up in a small town near northern Missouri, where her family lived near a forest thick with tangled branches and dense, shadowy trees. One summer day, Laura, who was about 10, and her younger brother Tommy were dropped off at their neighbor Mrs. Green's house. She looked after a few kids from the neighborhood, and they often played outside until it got dark. That day, Laura and Tommy joined two other kids in a game of tag, but soon a disagreement over the rules turned into a heated argument. Not wanting to spoil their day, Laura and Tommy decided to do something else. "Let's pick some flowers," Laura suggested. She knew a patch of delicate white blossoms grew near the edge of the forest, just out of sight. They loved giving wildflower bouquets to Mrs. Green, who would always put them in a jar on the windowsill. Laura thought the flowers were Queen Anne's lace, but looking back, she wasn't so sure. The two of them trotted over to the woods and started picking the pretty flowers. They knew they weren't supposed to wander far, but the forest called to them in a way that felt too tempting to ignore. Just beyond the patch of flowers, they noticed a narrow, twisting path leading deeper into the trees. "Let's see where it goes," Tommy whispered, eyes wide with curiosity. Laura hesitated but then nodded. Together, they ventured down the shadowy path, ducking under branches and stepping over tangled roots. It was quiet and strangely cool beneath the thick canopy, and Laura's heart raced with excitement and a tiny hint of fear. Eventually, they came to an old, rickety bridge crossing a dry creek bed. Laura paused, sensing something different about this place. Beyond the bridge, the path opened into a small clearing where moss-covered stones were arranged in a circle around an old stone well. The well was like something out of a fairy tale, with stairs built into the sides that seemed to spiral down into darkness. Laura found a pebble and tossed it into the well, waiting for the splash, but no sound came. They waited and waited. "That's so weird," Tommy murmured, peering over the edge. "Maybe it's bottomless." They laughed nervously and decided to search for more pebbles to toss in. As Laura wandered around the edge, she noticed a few large stones almost hidden under the leaves and moss. She crouched down and brushed one off, revealing faint carvings, names and dates. Slowly, she realized they were gravestones. She looked around, taking in the silence. "Tommy," she whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. "I think this is a graveyard." Just then, Tommy touched her shoulder. "Look over there," he said, pointing to the other side. Laura followed his gaze and froze. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, barely visible among the shadows. It was tall, motionless, and covered in dark, scraggly fur or feathers. She couldn't tell which. Its eyes gleamed red in the dim light, unblinking, and seemed to pierce right through her. Laura wanted to scream, but no sound would come. She felt glued to the ground, unable to look away. Tommy tugged at her arm, whispering urgently, "Laura, we need to go. Now." The clouds shifted, and the figure moved. It raised its long, dark arms, or were they wings? With one powerful leap, it flew up into the trees, perching on a branch like some strange, nightmarish bird. This finally snapped Laura out of her daze. She grabbed Tommy's hand, and together they bolted back toward the bridge. They ran faster than they ever had in their lives, crashing through the branches and barely noticing when the path scraped their arms and legs. They reached the bridge, crossed it, and finally dared to look back. The figure stood at the edge of the clearing, watching them with those piercing red eyes. A chill ran down Laura's spine as she turned and sprinted the last stretch to Mrs. Green's house, her legs burning and heart pounding. When they burst through the door, breathless and wide-eyed, Mrs. Green looked up in alarm. "What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." Laura tried to explain, but the words tangled in her mouth. Tommy, equally shaken, didn't say much either, except to insist they saw something. Mrs. Green gently scolded them for wandering into the woods and tried to reassure them that nothing strange lived out there. But even years later, Laura would remember that figure, the well and the silent, watching red eyes. As Laura grew older, she sometimes wondered if it had been an odd reaction to something in the woods. But she and Tommy both remembered it the same way, even as adults, so many years later. And she had a small scar on her knee from that day, a little reminder of the run, the fear, and the strange experience they had. The factory on the edge of town had stood empty for as long as I could remember. It was a massive brick building, surrounded by a rusting iron fence and tucked behind rows of overgrown trees and bushes. No signs marked its purpose, and no one ever seemed to go in or out. People said it had been closed down decades ago, but no one knew why. I was drawn to it. I'd pass it on my walks through town, wondering about the stories hidden in those walls. One day, I decided I couldn't just wonder anymore. I grabbed my camera and packed a lunch, planning to explore the outside and, if I could manage it, peek inside. I'd take photos to capture the building's charm, brick by worn brick, before it decayed further. As I arrived, I psyched myself up to climb the fence. But then, just as I approached, the gate creaked open. A sleek van rolled silently through and disappeared around the back of the building. I froze. If a van was driving in, maybe the place wasn't abandoned. Trespassing on private property could be serious trouble, so I turned around, my curiosity bubbling even more than before. Over the next week, I asked people around town if they knew anything about the building. My friends shrugged, dismissing it as an old relic, and my family thought it was just an empty space that hadn't been touched in years. No one seemed to know or care what was going on there. But I couldn't let it go. I needed to know why this place seemed so off-limits. I turned to the internet, hoping I'd uncover some history or news on the building, but found nothing. No records, no news articles. Even stranger, when I tried looking up the address on Google Maps, the entire property was blurred out. It didn't make any sense. Places aren't usually blurred out unless there's a specific reason. What could they be hiding? My curiosity turned into an obsession. I drove by every day, spending hours in my car watching from a distance with binoculars. On the first day, I saw it again. A van slipped through the gate, just like before. But this time, I noticed something odd. The van's license plate had a farm use tag. I didn't know much about farming, but this wasn't farm country, and there was no reason for a plain van to be using a farm tag around here. The next few days I saw more of these vans, each with the same tag, driving in and out. Then one evening, something unsettling happened. A van pulled up to the gate, and a man stepped out wearing a white coat, carrying a small metal cage. The cage had something moving inside, a small animal maybe. My stomach dropped as I watched him walk through the doors, and a dark suspicion began to grow in me. I couldn't shake the image of that man and his cage. Was this building being used for something cruel? After weeks of watching from a distance and trying to gather information, I realized I'd learned all I could from the outside. I knew it was risky, but I felt I had to see what was inside. Late one night, I dressed in dark clothes and crept through a gap in the fence. I stepped through a broken window and entered the building. Inside, the place was eerily silent. Rows of cages lined the walls, each holding a small, trembling animal. They were stacked floor to ceiling, animals peering through the bars with fearful eyes. I realized with horror that I'd stumbled into some kind of testing lab. The animals were kept in poor conditions, their cages unclean, and many looked malnourished. The silence was broken only by their soft whimpers, and each sound twisted my stomach tighter. I had only my phone's light to guide me, but what I saw made me want to run. Every cage held a small, helpless creature, staring out into the dim room as if pleading for escape. The scene was overwhelming, and I felt a wave of helplessness. I wanted to free them, to help them, but I was just one person, breaking the law by being there in the first place. Leaving the building was harder than going in. I had to pull myself away, every step filled with guilt. My head swirled with what I'd seen. I couldn't unsee those terrified animals, couldn't forget their haunted eyes. Back home, I tossed and turned, my mind replaying the scene over and over. Each whimper, each fearful face echoed in my mind. Every time I managed to drift into sleep, nightmares jolted me awake again. Days passed, but I couldn't shake the weight of what I'd seen. Telling someone might help, but how could I explain? I couldn't risk exposing myself or my family by admitting I'd broken into the building. Even so, I couldn't keep silent about the suffering I'd seen. Each time I closed my eyes, the animals' faces haunted me, their silent pleas echoing in the dark. Finally, I decided I had to do something, even if it was small. I began researching ways to anonymously report animal abuse, to send out what information I had about the building. It was a small step, but it was all I could do for now. Those animals deserved a voice, and if I could somehow provide one without risking my family's safety, I'd finally be able to sleep. On the outskirts of town, hidden beneath the gnarled limbs of old trees and tangled vines, sat an abandoned bus that no one dared approach. Once, years ago, it had been part of the town's busy routes, filled with the laughter and chatter of people on their daily commutes. But one night, everything changed. It was a foggy evening when the bus caught fire as it rounded a sharp corner near the edge of town. The flames spread quickly, and before anyone could react, the bus became an inferno. Trapped inside, none of the passengers escaped. By the time help arrived, all that remained was a smoldering shell filled with shadows and silence. Since that day, it sat there, untouched and avoided by everyone, a tragedy that haunted the town's memory. Over time, people began to call it the ghost bus. Years passed, and the bus became more than just an abandoned vehicle. It was a source of fear, with stories of ghostly sightings spreading like wildfire. People whispered that on certain foggy nights, when the moon hid behind thick clouds, the bus would start to glow faintly in the dark, as if flames still flickered around it. Some claimed to hear the faint sounds of footsteps moving up and down the aisles, as if restless spirits wandered back and forth, searching for an escape that never came. Others swore they could hear the murmur of voices, soft whispers mixing with the wind, or sometimes a soft, heartbreaking cry from deep within the bus. No one dared to go near it, not even in the daytime. But one night, a young boy named Leo decided to test his courage. He'd heard the legends and stories his whole life, but curiosity got the best of him. With only a flashlight in hand, he made his way to the bus, his heart pounding in his chest. The moment he approached, the air grew cold, almost icy. As he raised his flashlight and peered through the bus's cracked windows, he thought he saw something move inside, a shadow, faint and fleeting, gliding along the empty seats. Leo took a step closer, the air filled with a faint smell of smoke, though there was no sign of fire, only the quiet remains of the abandoned bus. Then, in the silence, he heard it, the faint creak of the bus door swinging shut. Leo's heart skipped a beat. His hand tightened around his flashlight, but his legs were frozen in fear. He looked up at the windows again, and for a brief moment, he saw pale faces staring back at him, their eyes hollow and dark, as if they were trapped in a world he could never understand. Panicked, Leo stumbled back, barely able to breathe. He turned and ran, never looking back, feeling the weight of unseen eyes following him all the way home. After that night, he never spoke of what he'd seen, but he was sure of one thing: the stories were true. To this day, the ghost bus remains, waiting silently in the shadows. And every now and then, on those foggy nights, a faint glow appears in the distance, flickering like a fire that refuses to die. No one dares approach, and the bus remains, a place of restless spirits, holding on to the final moments of a journey they can never complete.